Hello, folks. We'll get started here in just a moment. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We'll get started on today's webinar in just a moment. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. We'll just give folks just one more minute here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, in the interest of time, why don't we jump in? Hello, my name is Tim Daly, and I am the director of the Joyce Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. And thank you for joining today's discussion in our Lunch and Learn webinar series on emerging research into gun violence. For today's discussion, we're really excited to be joined by experts from the National Policing Institute to discuss a new report that examines the design and implementation of laws mandating the reporting of lost and stolen firearms. Before we dig into today's discussion, just a few quick housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is being recorded, and in the coming days will be made available on the Joyce Foundation's website. And after today's discussion, we'll be sure to share a version of the presenter's slides and any other key materials that are referenced in today's webinar. The webinar will last about 1 hour, with the final 20 minutes or so being reserved for your questions. And to that end, if you have a question for either of today's speakers, please include it in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of the screen. I'd encourage you to submit your questions as you think of them, even if the speakers are still presenting. So with that housekeeping aside, let's jump into today's discussion. According to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, tens of thousands of firearms are stolen from private owners each year. This data comes as new research from the University of California, Davis confirms that lost and stolen firearms are more likely to be used in a crime. In response, 15 states and several cities have enacted policies requiring gun owners to report the theft or loss of a firearm. However, questions have been raised about the efficacy of these laws and how they should be implemented. To further talk about these approaches and to weigh in on how best to develop and implement these strategies moving forward, I'm pleased to be joined by Jim Burch, president of the National Policing Institute, also known as NPI, and his colleague, Annalise Pietenpaul, a senior research associate with the organization. Prior to joining NPI in 2015, Mr. Burch served more than 20 years at the U.S. Department of Justice, having been appointed to various senior and executive leadership positions. This included appointments as the acting director of the Bureau of Justice Assistance from 2009 to 2011, acting assistant director of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives from 2014 to 2015. Meanwhile, Annalise Pietenpaul works on NPI's Place Network Investigations Project, an emerging gun violence reduction initiative, coordinating the implementation of the project across 6 law enforcement agencies nationwide. Annalise earned her PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati and her master's of public administration from the University of Wyoming. With that, I'll turn the floor over to Jim to get us started.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you to everyone at the Joyce Foundation for giving us this opportunity, A, to do this work, and B, to now share this work with roughly 100 people and more around the country. So we're excited to get into some of these findings. Joining me, as you mentioned, Tim, is Annalise Pietenpaul, and she is going to start the presentation out talking about some of the background research that we looked at, which is kind of how we start every project like this. We basically do a literature review to make sure we have a complete understanding of what the research is telling us before we go further into the study. So I'll jump back in as soon as Annalise sets the stage for us on what the research tells us about related topics. Annalise?
Thank you very much. Could you please move to the next slide? So let's start with the overall issue of gun crime in the United States. Unfortunately, we all know firearm-related deaths are a reality in the US. According to the CDC, there were more than 48,000 firearm-related deaths in the US in 2022. Almost 15,000 were firearms-related homicides, according to the FBI's NIBRS data. Additional CDC data suggests more than 70% of individuals medically treated for firearms injuries suffered from assaults, suggesting that crime is a major component. Unfortunately, gun violence disproportionately impacts communities of color and young people. In 2022, homicides were the leading cause of death for Black males ages 10 to 24, and the second leading cause of death for Hispanic Latino males ages 15 to 24. Next slide, please. Firearms move through a supply chain from the initial sale through the end of the gun's life. In this webinar, the end of the firearm's life is typically when the gun ends up in law enforcement's hands after its suspected use in a crime. These are called crime guns. Many of these recovered guns' origins can be traced through the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives tracing protocols. Guns tend to start in the legal supply chain of manufacture or import, distribution, and retail sale. It is legal for most adults in the United States to purchase firearms, unless they're prohibited possessors. However, after that initial sale, there may be one or many intermediate transfers to other individuals that occur either legally or illegally, which may not be well documented. Examples of transactions that occur outside the regulated processes include private sales, such as estate sales, gifting, straw purchasing, or obtaining the gun through criminal activity like burglary and theft. These undocumented transactions can make it difficult to know how criminals gain access to their firearms. Often, data do not exist to allow researchers to highlight the trajectories of crime guns. While advocacy groups recognize the importance of addressing lost and stolen firearms, research might not always be able to uncover the scope of the problem. We do know, however, that traced crime guns tend to be possessed by somebody other than the purchaser when it was used in a crime. The ATF traced 1.48 million crime guns from 2017 to 2021. Nearly all of these traces contain purchaser and/or possessor information. Of those crime guns, 58% had a different purchaser than possessor. Another 29% of traced crime guns had a known purchaser, but the possessor was unknown. Only 12% of crime guns had the same purchaser and possessor. This means that the majority of crime guns do have some form of undocumented transfer of ownership before ending up at a crime scene. Next slide, please. It is very difficult to know how many stolen and lost guns are used to commit crimes. However, some studies do estimate the proportion of lost and stolen firearms that end up as crime guns. Cook looked at Chicago as a case study, finding that 2.8% of guns recovered and submitted for tracing in a year were reported stolen in the jurisdiction. This is likely not an accurate estimate of the number of guns recovered that were stolen because it misses the instances where the theft was unreported or was reported to an agency other than the Chicago Police Department. Getting accurate findings is so difficult when lost and stolen firearms are not universally reported and documented, which prevents tracing efforts from linking crime guns to the loss or theft. Surveys of jail and prison inmates are another way to help us better understand how guns end up in criminal hands. These surveys show only about 4% of respondents obtained the guns they used in the commission of their crime from theft directly. 10% of respondents indicated they purchased their guns from a licensed dealer. A full 70% of inmates obtain guns from family, friends, or street sources, such as fences, drug dealers, brokers who sell guns, or gangs. These underground street markets, which likely obtained at least some firearms through theft or other illegal means, sourced 1/3 of the inmates' firearms. We do have one strong study with amazingly complete data. This recent assessment of firearm recovery and crimes in California showed a strong link between lost and stolen firearms and the subsequent use in a crime. Using California's dealer records of sales data and crime gun recovery records that are maintained in the California Department of Justice automated firearms system, the research team traced recovered crime guns from 2010 to 2021 back to their initial transaction, including purchases, pawns or pawn redemptions, and any transfers of ownership. Due to California's law requiring the reporting of lost or stolen firearms, recovered crime guns that had been lost or stolen within the state could be accurately connected in this database. Robinson and colleagues found that lost guns are 2.99 times more likely to be subsequently used in a crime, and stolen guns are 8.93 times more likely. The team found strong associations for both handguns and long guns. They concluded their findings by suggesting, considering measures to secure firearms from theft and loss should be a primary focus for prevention of firearms-related crimes moving forward. It is also important to note that some researchers disagree or are uncertain that firearms are stolen primarily for use in crimes. Economic analyses have suggested the trade in guns is driven by the economic value of guns and regulatory conditions in different markets, which follows patterns common to other commodities. Profit may be a stronger motivator for firearm theft than the desire to obtain a gun for use in a crime. However, as Philip Cook poignantly stated in his 2018 article, Gun Theft and Crime, when a gun is stolen, it is by definition in the hands of a criminal. Next slide, please. The previous slide highlighted that an unclear but non-trivial amount of lost and stolen firearms end up being used in crimes. Now let's look at the scope of the problem. It is first important to highlight the difference between thefts from private sources, FFLs, and interstate shipments. FFLs are federal firearms licensees. Individuals must be licensed by the ATF to engage in the business of manufacturing, importing, and/or dealing in firearms. Interstate shipments occur when firearms are shipped from manufacturers, wholesalers, or FFLs by common carrier. Sometimes a firearm is lost or stolen from an FFL's inventory or from common carriers in interstate shipment. FFLs are required to report these incidents to ATF and local law enforcement within 48 hours. This creates a somewhat complete and reliable data set of lost and stolen firearms from FFLs. Thefts from private sources occur when a gun owner experiences the theft of their firearm. Unlike thefts from FFLs, firearm thefts from private sources are only required to be reported if the state has mandatory reporting laws. This can create some massive problems with missing data. While the National Crime Victimization Survey found 75% of victims of gun theft reported it, that estimate might be inflated, and even if it is fully accurate, that still means we're missing 25% of the data. Therefore, the statistics for thefts from private sources should be interpreted as an undercount of the true scope of the problem. According to the ATF's analysis of recovered crime guns, reported thefts from private persons, as opposed to FFLs and shipping carriers, averaged about 205,000 per year from 2017 through 2021, for a total of over 1 million firearms. Thefts from private sources represent the vast majority of documented firearm thefts at 95.6%. FFLs reported approximately 6,900 thefts per year, whereas interstate shipments resulted in approximately 2,600 thefts per year. Let's do some math. There were 1,074,022 firearms reported stolen from 2017 through 2021. And that is an undercount. Remember, only 75% of private thefts are reported. Let's assume about 3% of those end up as crime guns. Again, likely an undercount, but we don't really know. That is still 32,221 firearms that were recovered as crime guns during this time frame. Next slide, please. Even with incomplete data, we know lost and stolen firearms are a problem. The question becomes, how do we prevent this? Some states have passed mandatory reporting laws which require gun owners to report when their firearm is lost or stolen to law enforcement. Laws requiring gun owners to report lost or stolen firearms might help to encourage owners to protect their firearms so losing or stealing them is more difficult. So for example, locking them up in gun safes at home instead of leaving them in a vehicle. It might deter straw purchasers who might fear that failing to document firearms are no longer in their possession and end up at a crime scene might impose liability on them. It can aid gun tracing, improve prosecution outcomes, and uncover trafficking patterns. And finally, most interestingly for the researcher in me, gives a more accurate picture of the scope of the problem by decreasing the number of firearm losses and thefts that are unreported. Several states have already implemented mandatory reporting laws, as we will discuss on the next slide. However, the research is uncertain about the impacts of these laws, not because they don't seem to work, but more so because more rigorous research is needed. A RAND systematic review found no studies met the evaluation design criteria to assess the impact of lost and stolen firearm reporting on violent crime and other outcome variables. However, some research does exist. For example, Webster and colleagues used ATF gun trace data to measure the number of firearms recovered at crime scenes that were in different states than where the firearms were initially sold. The researchers found multiple gun laws that were significantly associated with fewer crime guns recovered across state borders, including the mandatory reporting of lost and stolen firearms. Kahane and Knight both reported similar findings, particularly noting that trafficked guns moved from states with more lax gun laws, so in this case, states that do not have mandatory reporting, to states with more stringent laws. Mandatory reporting can mitigate some of the missing data concerns. Improved data quality and stronger methodological designs can only enhance the causal assessments of mandatory reporting laws of lost and stolen firearms and should be considered as the research progresses. And now I will turn this over to my colleague Jim to talk about these mandatory reporting laws and the National Policing Institute study.
Thank you, Annalise. And can we go to the next slide, please? So what Annalise just went through for us probably confirms what many of us on this webinar probably already believed, which is that lost and stolen firearms are a problem. But what the research really helped us understand was how vastly unreported that is, and to help us also identify gaps in the research in terms of what we know about how guns go from the regulated market to the illicit or criminal market. And so research was a very important background for us to look at in doing this. But this study at this point really moves into more of a mixed methods approach, looking qualitatively at the implementation and the design of the state statutes that exist to requiring mandatory reporting of lost and stolen firearm. And as you can see here, there are 15 states and the District of Columbia and other municipalities that have these policies in place. The scope of our study was specifically looking at the 15 states and the District of Columbia as well. One of the things that we wanted to understand was variations in reporting times for citizens to report lost and stolen firearms, as well as the penalties that were associated for failing to the report, at least to the extent that there actually are any. We know that states tended to rely on a series of progressive sanctions, generally starting out with a fine and then moving into petty offenses, misdemeanors, and in at least one case, a felony potentially, and then further on. Some of the fines that exist in states were as little as $25 for first offenses. And in other cases, states tended to set maximum fines, and some of those were just a few $100s. And so there was literally no minimum that was established in some of these states. So the sanctions rubric, if you will, was one that was progressive, but never really progressed to the point where it was extraordinarily severe, enough to be a significant deterrent anyway, with the exception of a couple of states. And you can find that detailed in more detail in our report. Some states, but not nearly all, establish implementation requirements, including provisions for making purchasers aware of their responsibility to report lost and stolen firearms, as well as responsibilities placed on law enforcement for how they'll respond to a report of a lost or stolen firearm. Next slide, please. So we mentioned reporting timelines, and as you can see here from the map, the states really vary from as soon as possible once it's discovered, to no requirement at all, to 24 hours, to anywhere from 24 to 72 hours, and then in a few cases, 5 to 7 days from the time at which it was the loss or the theft was discovered. So there really is no consistency in terms of the reporting timelines that are applied, or even some of the conditions that might kick in. In other words, whether or not when you knew it was stolen or lost, and whether it was a good faith attempt, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. So the goals of our study were specifically to assess these state policies and to assess not only their design, but how they're being implemented, which required us to talk to law enforcement, and I'll get into that more in just a minute. We also wanted to assess the extent to which the laws are actually being used, although the input that we received from law enforcement tended to answer that question for us even before we began to look. Identifying opportunities to improve the reporting policies and laws, as well as improving the implementation. That is a theme for us here, is that we believe that the implementation is really an overlooked aspect of the policy development process, and one that we think this study really shows has to be considered on the front end, not on the back end. And then last, we wanted to look at ways of just generally encouraging people to report lost and stolen firearms more regularly. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this was a mixed methods approach and that we talked to law enforcement. We did the research literature review that Annalise walked you through. And then we began to look at the state statutes, at least those that existed as of December of 2023. And so any changes that may have taken place after December of 2023 would not be reflected in this research. But at that point, we began to want to seek the input of law enforcement officials. And so we conducted structured interviews with police executives in states that had these laws in place. But we found that we needed to really understand more. And so when we held a focus group to include not only police executives, but members of their management teams or leadership or command staff, as well as bringing in investigators, patrol officers, and others who could talk to us about their understanding of firearm theft, the reporting requirements, and their enforcement of those state laws that require reporting of lost and stolen firearms. Those agencies that participated spanned across the United States. They also varied in terms of their size. We had some agencies that had less than 50. We had some agencies that had more than 1,000. We wanted to get a perspective across all different types of law enforcement from different regions of the country. So that was our approach. Next slide. So the key takeaways for us, as I've summarized a little bit already so far, is that the approaches to these policies really do vary widely. And the implementation, as well as the design to some extent, is really not well understood. It hasn't really been examined to the extent that we found. So there are really very few best practices that have been identified. As I mentioned previously, implementation of the laws is weak. We heard this from law enforcement, and we heard explanations for that, and some of that is detailed in much more granularly in the report, as you can see. And poor implementation, we think, basically impacts our ability to really be able to assess whether or not these laws are being used and to what effect. Right now, we really don't have the confidence that they're being utilized and enforced or fully implemented in the way that they could be. We do think, though, and it's important to underscore, that the policy does have potential for significant impact in reducing harm, as well as reducing property crimes of theft and other kinds of crime as well. And so we think that's an important point that we want to underscore here today, is that even though our assessment is somewhat critical of the design and implementation processes, that should not be interpreted to mean that we don't support these state statutes when designed in a way that takes implementation into consideration. Next slide, please. So the findings in a little more detail here for you is that timely reporting can deter some firearm diversion. We know this from research, and provide more effective investigation and recovery. Think about it in a very practical way. If law enforcement doesn't know about the theft, they can't investigate it. They can't recover the firearm. And so this is sort of an important point that I think needs to be driven home for gun owners at the point of purchase. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The statutory approaches that agencies use, as I mentioned, really, or I should say states use, really rely on fines and fees as the primary deterrent or penalty. But we think that that may not be the best approach because in some states, these fines are as little as $25 or that a maximum is set, so there is literally no minimum. So we think that Oregon's approach is one that should be considered in a little more detail. What Oregon does is they do have a fine as part of the first offense. But Oregon goes a little bit further and talks about enhanced civil liability for failure to report. So as a gun owner, if I fail to report one of my lost or stolen firearms, and that gun is used in a crime that injures a person or creates damage to property, the law determines that to be negligence, and then I can be subjected to enhanced civil liability. When we looked at the research on this issue, and we were kind of scanning the internet, if you will, for what's known about lost and stolen firearm reporting, one of the things that really jumped out to us is the number of legal experts and law firms that really drove home to gun owners the importance of avoiding the civil liability. And this is what really matters to people. There was hardly no information out there from these law firms about what to do if you're fined $25 for failing to report your firearm. Instead, it was all focused on, are you subjected to enhanced liability if you fail to report, and what you should do about it. That really encouraged us to think more about this as a very important tool to gain compliance without having to rely on additional fines and fees associated with the criminal justice system. Overall, we think that implementation really was overlooked in the design process, or was not considered as through the negotiation around the policies, and that this is a major challenge to the effectiveness of some of these state policies. Next slide. So what we also learned when we started talking to law enforcement, and this was a view that we also saw echoed in some of the gun rights organizations' literature, is that many sort of question the legitimacy of these laws because of the fact that there are, if you think about the population of gun owners versus the population of gun owners who have a firearm lost or stolen for, report a firearm lost or stolen for as part of a criminal scheme, those populations are not similar. So the population of gun owners is so much larger, so many more gun owners that may become a victim, if you will, of a stolen firearm, or it may have just lost their firearm, that could end up failing to report and being fined or investigated for failing to report, even though they are perfectly innocent and lost their firearm or had it stolen not as part of a criminal scheme. So the much larger group of people in that audience than in the group of people who are willing to use "I lost my gun" or "my gun was stolen" as an excuse or a cover for a straw purchase, for example. And so the way that plays out is we heard from law enforcement, and we saw in this literature online that many people believe that these laws will result in legal gun owners, innocent gun owners who are victims of theft, being penalized for failing to report because they didn't know, or they didn't understand what was required. They didn't have the documentation needed to make a full report, et cetera. And so this was an issue that we found really needs to be considered in the design of these laws. The promotion and the use of the laws, as I mentioned, could deter straw purchasing. This was something that was tested in research in California through an experimentally designed research. It was done by RAND, folks like Greg Ridgway, for example. They were able to identify that using this law, notifying purchasers during their waiting period to pick up their firearm, notifying them about their responsibility to report under these laws, resulted in a larger number of firearms not being picked up. And so the assumption is that straw purchasers, or would have been straw purchasers, were deterred as a result of being notified by law enforcement of their responsibility affirmatively to report these guns lost or stolen, if that's what was likely to happen. So we know that it can have an effect on straw purchasing. The other piece of feedback that we received from law enforcement in some jurisdictions, but not all, is that identifying stolen firearms is relatively rare in some of these places, because most of the firearms they are recovering are privately manufactured firearms that are unserialized, or ghost guns. And so the takeaway from that is, as ghost guns or PMFs begin to become more common at crime scenes elsewhere around the country, this issue may actually become even more challenging to address. Next slide. So more in terms of what we learned from law enforcement, it was interesting to us as we kind of went around the country in the different regions, the different agencies, talking to them about their experience with the recovery of lost and stolen firearms. None of them seemed to indicate that that the crime guns they were recovering were most often stolen. And similarly, none reported receiving a significant number of lost and stolen reports. Even the largest agency that was included in our focus group provided data to us that suggested that there were a very small number of lost and stolen firearm reports. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening. It just means that they're not receiving those reports. Again, an implementation challenge potentially. The lack of resources was cited by law enforcement multiple times through our focus groups, in particular, the lack of investigative staffing and resources. And as pointed out by law enforcement to us, if there's a crime that is punishable by a fine of $25 or a maximum of $500, for example, how can they justify responding and investigating that kind of an offense when they're not responding to other kinds of 911 calls due to resource limitations? So these are the kinds of things that law enforcement raised concerns about, and they really reflected on those penalties as a way of helping them to understand what the priority of enforcing those policies is. So they interpreted those penalties as an indication of to what extent the state prioritizes those policies. Law enforcement systems were also mentioned to us as an area of challenge. The ATF points this out in their trace reports as well. In particular, that some of the crime reporting programs, the UCR in particular, but also to a lesser extent NIBRS, may not offer us all of the opportunities that we need in order to track the firearms that are stolen as part of a property crime. There is some data on this, but we think that it could be improved for sure. But the other piece that we found from law enforcement that was really important was the unawareness of how stolen firearms are placed into the NCIC gun file. So we know that in some states, this occurs through state law enforcement systems. It's not a direct entry into the NCIC's gun file. But in other cases, it was very difficult to verify if agencies had a protocol in place to ensure that a recovered stolen firearm was reported into the NCIC gun file, or if a recovered firearm that they don't know to be stolen was checked against that gun file to identify whether or not it had been stolen previously. Next slide. So it's kind of moving more towards summarization here, is that the law enforcement's feedback to us was that the purpose and intent of the law was really not well understood. And particularly when you lay that against the nature of the penalties that are associated with failing to report. Some in our focus groups mentioned that it appeared to be more politically driven than anything else. And then it was focused on less important public safety problems than what they were otherwise dealing with. There was also a lot of back and forth conversation in our focus group about how these laws could be effective in deterring gun crime. And so particularly as it relates to straw purchasing and the deterrent aspect of these laws was something that was not well understood. And so in our report, one of the things we recommend is more training, more awareness, more translation of research within the law enforcement community about why these kinds of laws are so important and how addressing these issues can impact gun crime. Law enforcement also pointed to the need for others beyond law enforcement to be a part of the response to these issues. They called for really a whole of community approach, particularly focusing on prevention as opposed to enforcement, and pointed out the need to not rely on law enforcement only to enforce these kinds of policies, but instead to encourage more voluntary compliance and cooperation through prevention, through problem-oriented policing approaches. Two approaches that we identified as part of our research that are, if you will, more problem-oriented, and we think deserving of more expansion are the Save a Casing program, which provides gun owners with an envelope that allows them to document the critical information on the outside of the envelope about their firearm, and then to include inside the envelope 2 shell casings. That envelope is sealed, it's stored separately from the firearm, so that if that firearm is lost or stolen, that envelope could be given to the law enforcement agency. And right away, you have all of the required information right there on the front of the envelope. Because the truth of the matter is, while there are many gun owners that are very good about documenting all of the details that are required, there are many others that couldn't tell you what make, model, serial number, or caliber their firearm was. They just know that it was a gun and it was stolen. So having them document that information on the outside of the envelope, and then to give law enforcement the shell casings that can be used for ballistics imaging, gives them investigative leads right away to know if that gun is being used in crimes in the community or in the region or elsewhere in the country. A very important and innovative program that we think is deserving of more look. In addition, some states, particularly Ohio, Florida, and Utah, have stolen firearm portals that members of the public can query using a serial number of a firearm they intend to purchase. That query returns back a notice to the purchaser that would tell them not to proceed with the purchase. And in some cases, as based on our understanding, is that law enforcement agencies that submitted the stolen firearm report are notified that a prospective purchaser in the jurisdiction has checked on that particular firearm. So they know that gun was stolen and is now being offered for sale somewhere. So we think more states should consider this, and the potential at the federal level for offering some way to connect these portals together so that we're not just checking one state at a time, but we have the ability to check multiple states at once. Next slide. So other recommendations for policy change. Clearly, we've talked a lot about the fine-based penalty systems. We called out Oregon's approach in essentially codifying that failing to report a lost or stolen firearm that is used to injure a person or create damage to property, that is defined as negligence in state law, and exposes that person who failed to report it to enhanced civil liability, assuming they were aware, of course, of the requirement to report, which, as I mentioned, is not something that every state requires sellers to notify purchasers of. In fact, only a small number of states make that requirement. And that's, as you can see here in that third bullet. And then the fourth bullet, as I've talked about, it was unclear to us in talking to law enforcement the extent to which they consistently report stolen firearms into the NCIC system or use the NCIC gun file to check a recovered firearm to see if it has been stolen. This is something that we think could be made more consistent. Some states have recovered firearm protocols. New Jersey, for example, is one of those states. If you look at that protocol does not mention the NCIC gun file as one of the things that has to be done. It mentions a variety of other steps that need to be taken, but not the check to see if it was lost or stolen. Next slide. We think that it's important to provide training for officers to have a better understanding of the design of these laws, how they're structured, and how how compliance and implementation of these laws can help address gun crime. We also think that it's necessary for them to help to understand how these systems will help us investigate and prevent future gun crime. Assessing gaps in law enforcement reporting system capabilities is another important issue that needs to be addressed. We think that could be done nationally or otherwise. So we made recommendations in our report to the federal level as well as to states and other policymakers. I've talked a little bit previously about these stolen firearm registries that folks in Ohio, Florida, and Utah have implemented. The AG's office in particular in Ohio has done a lot to promote their registry. And then the Save a Casing program, which is in place in a number of states, Wisconsin, Florida, and others. And we think that program is deserving of replication and additional research. And then last is, in terms of addressing firearm thefts, one of the things that came up, not only in our review of the research, but in our conversations with law enforcement, was the continued and significant growth of stolen firearms from vehicles. And so as we talk to law enforcement about addressing these issues, part of the solution has to be using problem-oriented policing approaches to address firearm theft and diversion. Next slide. And then at the Fed, we've made recommendations in our report for the federal level, as I said, encouraging through funding and otherwise the replication of these registries, these state registries, as well as safe casing programs, improving awareness amongst law enforcement, investigators, and patrol officers about the NCIC gun file and how the system can support them in their work, and then prioritizing research on firearm theft and in particular on mandatory reporting laws. We think these are three things that the federal government could do through their funding arms and otherwise. Next slide. So that here you have the report. This is an image of the report that was released recently. We've disseminated it to over 200 policymakers, including mayors, as well as state legislatures and governors, and also sent it out to others in local law enforcement. You can access it through the link that went out in the chat, as well as through the QR code. Tim, I will turn it back over to you to facilitate the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Annalise. That was tremendous. And look forward to getting to some of our questions here. So Jim and Annalise, why don't you come back on screen and we'll jump right in. If you do have a question for either of our speakers today, if you wouldn't mind dropping that in the Q&A feature, we'll do our best to get to as many of them as possible. There were a few questions that came in during the discussion. A few of them were generally asking, can you say more about what you mean by theft? We got a few questions about, if a gun is, if a gun is when a gun is considered to be stolen or otherwise. Can you just say a little bit more about the definition of that?
And I would love to get more context on the question, Tim, but I think what we're talking about here is when a gun owner realizes that the firearm has been stolen from their home, their vehicle. That is I think what we're talking about here, versus lost, which is I don't know where it is. I can't find it. I don't know if it has been stolen or not. Is that what you mean, Tim?
Yeah, let me give you a little bit more context. Sorry about that. So one person asked, does thefts, plural, mean an individual gun or an instance of stealing? For example, could multiple guns be stolen in a single theft incident, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. No doubt about it. And some of the systems challenges that we talked about also relate to our ability to understand how many firearms were stolen, not that just a firearm was stolen. So particularly the summary reporting systems don't give us a lot of good insight into those kinds of issues. So yes, a theft could mean the theft of one firearm or many firearms. But we are talking about mainly firearm theft from individuals versus FFLs. Annalise, did you want to add anything onto that?
No, I thought that summarized it nicely. There is a difference between incidents of theft and then the count of firearms that are stolen. It is possible to have one incident of theft where multiple firearms are stolen in that. So kind of different statistics. This presentation reported the number of individual firearms stolen, not the incidents.
Got it. Great. And then another person asked, if law enforcement agencies are getting so few reports of lost and stolen firearms, how are we estimating that upwards of 205,000 private guns are lost or stolen every year or every few years?
Yeah, Tim, that's actually a great question. And it's based on the source of the data coming from ATF traces. Annalise, I'll let you take that one unless you want me to run with it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that one of the things that we tried to estimate early on in this research is what is that number, right? How many are lost and stolen? And because we have so few states that require reporting, and we know that even in those states that have requirements to report, that compliance is an issue, we had to turn to other sources. And the best available source, the most timely source of data that we have right now is the ATF's reports that have just been issued. That data comes from their E-Trace or their tracing programs. So when a firearm is recovered by a law enforcement agency, it can be submitted for tracing. Through that tracing process, they've identified that those firearms were stolen. They've been doing this for years. They've just published this data. And it was that data that we used to help us understand what's the scope of this problem. So it's a non-traditional way of addressing this. Annalise, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I totally agree with that. And it also represents the data issue overall and the likely undercount from it, because these are only the guns that have been submitted to the ATF for tracing. So it's not, again, it's not the whole scope of the problem.
Great. Let's keep going down to more questions. One person who is from a state that does not currently have one of the mandatory reporting laws, but are working on getting new policies to reduce guns stolen in cars. Would they be better to go with how to lock up the firearm in the car, or mandatory reporting of lost and stolen, do you think?
We recommend both. We think both are needed. And that's part of the point of the study too, is that we try to make here, is that, problem-oriented approaches are needed to try to prevent the theft of the firearms from vehicles and from homes. So safe storage is something that I think we should be pushing. There are a number of other problem-oriented policing approaches around locking your car, particularly at certain locations, storing the firearm safely or securely in the car. Those are all things that can be handled through a problem-oriented approach. But we know that not everybody's going to do those things. And so the reporting laws, we think, have to be in place. So a layered approach to addressing this is something that we think is important.
Great. You've mentioned that term a few times now, problem-oriented policing. Can you say a little bit more about what that is exactly?
I'm going to ask Annalise to take it, because this is what she's been working on for years.
Yeah, problem-oriented policing is a framework for policing where it focuses on specific problems and it tries to come up with solutions that are tailored to those problems. So in this instance, the specific problem would be gun thefts from vehicles, for example. And so we could brainstorm some possible solutions. So like a campaign, a door-to-door knock where you ask gun owners not to store their guns and vehicles, something like that. But it is a way to, instead of trying to focus on like the offender and trying to stop gun thefts by arresting people, it's not like that. It's more like focus on the specific targeted problem of gun thefts from vehicles and come up with specific targeted solutions. And then analyze your solutions and make sure that it works. And then if it works, keep doing it. And then if it doesn't work, go back to the drawing board and brainstorm something new.
Thanks for that. How often are lost and stolen guns reported in states that don't have these mandatory reporting laws?
That's a great question. I don't know that we saw any data on that. I can tell you the feedback from law enforcement was pretty, including law enforcement outside of states that have this policy, was pretty consistent that they don't see this a lot. So that was a consistent response that we got from law enforcement. Most of those participating in our focus group were from from states that have these laws, but there were a couple that did not. Annalise, I don't know if you know anything different on that.
No, I agree with you. We've got some missing data there.
Right. And what are the reactions from the quote unquote pro Second Amendment rights groups to these ideas or proposals of mandatory reporting? Are they supportive? Are they opposed? How do they land on these ideas?
So one of the things that we looked at after we heard from law enforcement about the legitimacy issue in particular and the politicization of this, we did look at what some of those groups have said about these laws and the position of their opposition, behind their opposition to them, and it was very consistent. In other words, the NRA in particular has said that they think that these laws will result in innocent gun owners who have been victimized by a theft to be re-victimized by a penalty for failing to report. And so we took this into consideration, not just because of the advocacy viewpoint, but from the law enforcement perspective, that moving away from a fine-based system and moving towards a system that places responsibility and enhanced civil liability on gun owners and educating them from the beginning, specifically, making a requirement that all sellers notify purchasers of their responsibility to report, that the acceptance of that responsibility is documented as part of the sale, and that the information that's required to report that firearm lost or stolen later has been collected in ways that it can be recovered when needed. Those are all important parts of the process, but moving away from a simple fine-based system where you can imagine someone calling the police and saying, you know, my firearm was stolen, I never reported it. You know, I don't know, I'm concerned about gun violence in my community. I wanted you to know about it. Well, the police, theoretically, the police come to the house and cite the person a $25 fine for failing to report. That's the theory that is being, you know, used there. We think instead of that, we think an approach that says you may face enhanced civil liability if you knew of your responsibility to report and you intentionally failed to report it. That now targets that law specifically on law violators who intend to say their gun was stolen or lost to conceal their criminality.
Thanks for that. So related to that, one person from Oregon says that one challenge they have in that state is that, you know, reporting happens to local law enforcement, but in many places, even when you report, police are so busy that they aren't able to respond. Do you have any recommendations around a centralized reporting system for the state?
I don't think we would. I mean, Annalise, feel free to jump in here if you see this differently, but this didn't come up. The solutions on this did not come up in our focus group. Certainly that problem we heard about a lot, in fact, directly from law enforcement. And so, you know, I think this may be something that we could think about creatively within the law that provides a way for gun owners to essentially bypass law enforcement. Right? If there's no fine, if there's no penalty that law enforcement needs to assess, and the only issue is enhanced civil liability, then I think it could be that burden of reporting could be shifted from law enforcement back to the gun owner, and then maybe some way through these state registries, we can create a mechanism for them to acknowledge that it's been reported. I don't know, just brainstorming here, but that the solutions on that were few and far between.
You know, another area. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Annalise.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would also add in that maybe a little bit of a culture change is needed to elevate this to the attention so that law enforcement does view it as a priority to at least get the losses and thefts documented so that we can at least track it.
Great. Thank you for that. And I mean, related to that is a question from Ohio. Does the report include any information about how states or cities enforce notification requirements?
Notification meaning notification from a seller to a buyer?
Yeah, about maybe, let's assume this question is about notification of their responsibilities to report lost and stolen.
No, I mean, other than through, you know, the sort of the regulatory process, which is generally going to apply to FFLs. Those regulatory authorities exist at the federal level, but they also exist at some state and some localities as well. So if they have those authorities, I think it could be something that's handled like through the inspection process, for example, to the extent that that's done. But that is an issue that we did not address in the report.
Got it. Another question from Connecticut. Is there a tension between safe storage laws and lost and stolen reporting in that a gun owner may be reluctant to report a stolen gun if they're required to secure it in the first place? And if so, how do you reconcile?
Well, I love this question, Tim, because I do think that's a potential issue to think through here. And at least one of the states, if not more, basically talked about the once that firearm has been reported stolen, that essentially relieves that person of those burden of responsibility. So it essentially sort of, I don't want to say it washes the sort of initial failure away, but I think some states have attempted to address this in the way they've written their policies so that, you know, it's not an issue of, hey, I didn't report within 24 hours and now I can't report it because I'm going to be subjected to this liability. I think some of the states have these policies where once you do report it, you're relieved of some of that enhanced liability.
Great. This person also asked if there is enough state-specific knowledge from this research that NPI could tailor guidance to particular states. Is that possible, or is there enough information about that?
Yeah, I think we'd love to do that, Tim. That's something, we've, I think, talked about just informally. I know the Department of Justice at the federal level has talked about model legislation. Others have talked about model legislation. I think that's something that should be taken up. I think there is enough that we've learned from this, from law enforcement, that we could offer some improvements through something like that.
Another person from a state that does not have one of these policies, but has been trying to work with policymakers to develop one, asks, do you have any recommendations about state or local policing associations or organizations that they should work with to potentially develop policies of this type?
Well, I think one of the key points of what we learned in this study and the way that we did it, when we talk about implementation, has to be an issue that's addressed at the design phase, not after the passage phase. I would just encourage you to reach out, not just to your chiefs and sheriffs associations within your state, but to individual agencies as well. So it is important to go through those associations, but it's also important to go directly to those agency leaders. I also think I wouldn't necessarily leave out labor groups potentially in some states. There are also other professional associations within states that represent law enforcement. But going direct, I think, is always the best method of engagement, and doing it at the time that the policy is being considered is vitally important.
Yep. We're almost at the time, but just a few more questions here. What about this issue of mistrust between gun owners and law enforcement? And I'm thinking also about perhaps Black and brown gun owners who really have deep-rooted mistrust. If the policy requires them to connect with law enforcement to notify them of their lost and stolen firearms, does that create an extra barrier or tension that we need to resolve?
Yeah, Tim, that's an awesome question too. It is something that I think has to be addressed, and I think it's not disconnected from this question about whether or not these policies are designed with the initial response being enforcement, right? The way these policies are mainly designed right now is if you fail to report, you're going to face a police action, and the police action is a fine. What we're recommending is that we reconsider that. And by reconsidering that, I think it may give us an opportunity to reframe whether or not there is any direct action with local law enforcement, or whether that reporting can be done without having to make contact directly with law enforcement. The reporting can eventually make its way to law enforcement. Obviously, that needs to happen, right? It's the only way we'll know if someone has lost 67 guns in the last 12 months, right? But I don't know that it's necessary, and law enforcement encouraged us to push that it may not be necessary to make them the first responder on these issues. So I think there's an avenue there for collaboration to have a better policy design.
Great. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Annalise, for your presentation today and running through all of these questions. We are so very grateful. And for those of you who joined us, as a reminder, today's webinar was recorded, and we will make it available on our website in the coming days. And we'll be sure to email it around to everybody who joined and registered in today's discussion. We'll also include in that the slides from today's discussion and some of the other key materials that were referenced. And finally, a note about future editions of the Joyce Foundation's Lunch and Learn webinar series on emerging research into gun violence. We're excited to announce that we have 2 coming up that you'll see information on very soon. The first is on June 5th at 12 p.m. Central on the topic of political violence and guns, and will include Garen Wintemute from the University of California, Davis, and Rachel Kleinfeld from the Carnegie Endowment. And then on June 20th at 12 p.m. Central, we'll be joined by the team at PERF, who will be talking about a new study that they have been undertaking on law enforcement opinions and engagement with community violence intervention strategies. So thank you again to our speakers and to all of you for joining today. We'll be sure to roll all this up into an email following today's discussion, and we look forward to connecting real soon. Take care.